one for the record books. Let me just... So, the Hubers lived a picturesque fairy tale life in Newport Beach, California. But sadly, in 1991, everything changed in what later felt like an instant. Dennis and Ione Huber and their daughter Denise were enjoying another summer in upscale Southern California, where they lived. Denise had graduated with her degree in social sciences from the University of California, and at the age of 23, continued to live at home with her parents while working at a local restaurant. Her mom said that Denise was enjoying life and really getting ready to settle down into a more permanent type job. However, the trajectory of Denise's life was cruelly halted one night in June. The Huber parents woke up on June 3rd to realize that Denise's bed was still empty. She had gone to a concert the night before with a friend from work, a man named Rob, and her parents had originally just assumed that she'd spent the night with a girl named Tammy, another friend from work. But when Denise was still missing by the time her parents returned home that afternoon, they really started to worry. Her mom and dad remember that day very clearly and what Denise had told them before she left for the concert. She stuck her head in the door. They were watching TV and she said, "I love you both. Don't worry about me." And she left. The concerned parents started calling Denise's friends in an effort to track her down. And they were really surprised to hear that Tammy had not heard from Denise recently, much less had hosted her at her house the night before. When they contacted Rob, who had gone to the concert with her, he also said he didn't know where Denise was and that she dropped him off at home the night before, after the concert. So Denise and Ione are pretty determined to find out. Dennis and Ione are pretty determined to find out what happened to Denise. So they get in the car and they retrace the route that Denise would have driven the night before. And during the drive, they make a pretty shocking discovery. They find Denise's car on the side of the road, on a fairly isolated part of the freeway. But Denise herself was nowhere to be found. The car had a flat tire, and they found a pair of pantyhose abandoned in the front seat. There was nothing else in the car. Denise's purse and car keys were missing. Police, of course, went to the car and searched for clues. They dispatched helicopters. They were using, anything that they could get their hands on to try to find Denise. The canine unit was deployed, and the dogs were able to trace her scent 75 yards away from her car before it disappeared. Investigators were stumped. They had nothing. It just appeared like Denise had totally vanished, said David Snowden, who was the police chief of the Costa Mesa Police Department at the time. The next morning, investigators met with the Hubers for an interview, and when they were asked if they thought that there was anyone who may have wanted to harm Denise, they had no idea. Denise was loved by her social circle, and she worked with many friends as a server at the old spaghetti factory, which we have one in St. Louis, which is near to me, and I love it there. Investigators began to trace Denise's steps. The night she went missing, she met up with Rob for the concert, so it only made sense to bring Rob in for questioning. When he got to the investigation, he confirmed he'd gone to the concert with Denise and they'd gone out for drinks at a local bar afterward. At the end of the night, close to 2 a.m., she dropped him off at home. Rob passed a polygraph test, so police considered other options. They questioned another friend of Denise's, a man named Steve, who Rob claimed was romantically involved with Denise, but his alibi checked out and they let him go as well. Investigators were right back at square one. As the case went on, Denise's disappearance made local headlines, and her parents even appeared on TV to plead with the public to share any information somebody might have regarding their daughter's disappearance. Authorities, meanwhile, started to fear the worst. Snowden recalled that he was convinced that she'd been abducted, and that they needed to find out who, why, and when. During the search for Denise, police received thousands of tips, but none of them led to any useful leads in the investigation. And eventually, the case went cold. The lack of answers left Denise's parents completely devastated. They were just incapacitated. They couldn't do anything, and they were grief-stricken and worried. And Dennis said at one point he thought, "I cannot go any lower. I cannot imagine that fear of being a parent." Unfortunately for the Hubers, it would take 3 more years for progress to be made in their daughter's case. Strangely enough, it was the actions of 2 people who never even knew Denise that would eventually lead to justice in her case. And this was the weirdest twist ever. It started off with a young couple who owned a Phoenix paint supply business. "It never leaves our mind," said Elaine Court. She owned the business with her then boyfriend, now husband, Jack Court. There was a swap meet in Prescott Valley that was nice and cool, and the 2 of them went, and they met a man there in July of 1994. His name was John Familaro, who painted houses, and he told them, "Oh, I have extra paint to sell." Thinking that this John character may have had inventory that they could sell as a part of their business, Jack and Elaine accepted John's invitation to pick up some product from his house. When they arrived, they noticed something sort of strange. A moving truck was in his driveway, backyard, and it had seemingly been abandoned, judging by the overgrowth near the tires. The couple were able to buy their supplies and leave without any incidents, but they were pretty suspicious because John had claimed that he had only moved into town 6 weeks ago, and the brush around this moving truck was way older than that. So Elaine and Jack kind of suspected he may have stolen it, and they secretly wrote down the license plate number, which I thought was incredibly smart. And they shared their concern with a deputy who had come to buy some paint. Back at the station, the officer ran the plates, and he discovered that the truck had indeed been reported stolen 6 months ago. So he decides to go to John's house, and when he gets there, nobody's home. But upon further inspection, he notices quite a few things that alarm him. There were chemicals located outside of the truck, and there was an extension cord leading from the back of it, prompting this deputy to suspect that whoever stole this truck may have been using it as a drug lab. Which, I'm suspicious, but that's not the first thing I would have considered. But hey, I really am into true crime, so Less than 1 hour later, agents from the narcotics team showed up at the house with a search warrant, and they proceeded to check the property. In the back of the truck, they found a deep freezer, which they assumed was filled with drugs. However, what they found inside was much, much worse. Inside were plastic bags, obviously with something inside of them, and there was this terrible odor, and one of the police officers, the sheriff, said, "I noticed frozen blood in the bottom of the freezer." He said, "When we cut open the plastic bag and peeled it back, I could see an arm, and as we began to open the bag further, it appeared to be a young adult female. The victim was found on her knees, with her head bent down and her arms handcuffed behind her back. Cloth had been stuffed in her mouth, which was then duct taped closed. It was a gruesome scene, and investigators were dealt with another surprise. When, in the midst of processing this scene, the resident responsible for the truck, John Joseph Familaro, pulls into the driveway. Now, despite the presence of a body in this truck, he seems really calm about the whole situation, which completely baffled investigators. They took him to the station for questioning, where he was strangely cooperative until they started asking about the freezer, at which point he responded, "I have nothing else to say," and requested an attorney. Still, despite his refusal to talk, police had probable cause to support taking him into custody, and they arrested him for murder and the theft of the moving truck. Meanwhile, investigators transported the victim's body to the medical examiner's office, where researchers would attempt to identify the victim. While they waited, investigators searched his home, and what they found was far from ordinary. There were various weapons strewn about just all over the place, and in the basement they found a blood-stained hammer and some dried tissues. Police, I don't know what kind of tissues, as far as bodily tissues, I don't know if it was brain matter, or I didn't investigate that much. victims started to appear, including women who had reported Familaro. They said he'd handcuffed them to beds without their consent, and there were other instances of some pretty disturbing, violent behavior. And suddenly, police are like, whoa, is this a serial killer that we've just uncovered? Authorities in Arizona got to work contacting law enforcement agencies in hopes of finding the identity of their Jane Doe. And it was then that they connected with investigators in California and learned that the woman they found in the freezer may have been the missing Denise Huber. Denise's purse was one of many found in Familaro's house, and all of her identifying information was still inside. They found the clothes that she'd been wearing when she was abducted, along with newspaper clippings about her disappearance that Familaro had collected. Fingerprints confirmed it was Denise, and her family was devastated. Dennis reportedly said, "I have never felt worse in my life. It's indescribable. It is the worst thing that can happen to you." An autopsy revealed that Denise had been sexually assaulted and that she had died from blunt force trauma to the skull. After being struck more than 30 times in the head with what was likely a hammer, and possibly the one that had been found in the house. It didn't take long for authorities to piece together what they believe happened. At the time of Denise's disappearance, Familaro had been running a paint business with a warehouse that was in Orange County, not far from where Denise's car had been found abandoned. When police went to search the warehouse, they found a room in the back with walls that were, as a spray of luminol revealed, covered in blood. Further testing showed that the blood belonged to Denise and Familaro. Police believe he'd been out hunting for victims when he came across Denise trying to fix the flat tire. He may have offered to help her, then struck her with a hammer, drug her back to his car, handcuffed her, took her back to his warehouse, where he assaulted and killed her. They do think that he hit her and then drug her to the car because the backs of her shoes were recovered, and the backs of them showed that the backside of the heels were rubbed off. Familaro, they believe, likely held on to Denise's body with the intention of burying it along with any other evidence in the pit that he was digging at the bottom of his house. In July of 1994, he stood trial for Denise's murder after pleading not guilty. I feel like that was very fast. It was like the same month. He was convicted of murder, kidnapping, and sentenced to death. He is currently awaiting his execution at San Quentin State Prison in California. The number one question that Denise's parents have had all this time is, why her? But last year, they got new information that may have given them an answer. 24 years after Denise's body was found, they found a letter. Well, they got a letter from somebody close to John Familaro. They called this person who told them when Denise went missing, John had recently dated a woman who left him. And this woman Denise, but it did bring them some closure after all these years, which I can imagine helped ease their mind just a little. I am incredibly sad for Dennis and Ione Huber losing their daughter in such a terrible, terrible way. I'm glad that she was found and that they could lay her to rest properly. I am incredibly surprised that they did not find any other bodies in this house with all of that stuff that they found, 12 driver's licenses. Why didn't more of these women come forward? It's just sad that a woman believes that when she's attacked that no one will believe her and that there's nothing they can do. And that just makes me so incredibly sad, because sometimes you just need to tell someone to make yourself feel better, and sometimes it's even more beneficial if that someone is the police, because maybe this man could have been caught before he hurt Denise. I don't know if it was a case of wrong place, wrong time. I think that he was a pretty weird dude, and it was the middle of the night on a fairly isolated section of highway. He saw that opportunity. She was out there trying to fix her tire, and he was just like, time. I do find it strange that maybe he started it off with hitting her in the head with a hammer, so that could potentially say that he was really angry at his ex, and Denise may have looked, her parents said they look like twins. It's just sad. She was 23, she had just graduated, she had her whole life ahead of her, and this crazy guy just happened to drive by and see someone who really resembled his ex, and obviously he was pretty wackadoo. My main question is, they didn't find her for 3 years afterward, so, and she was, pretty, not decomposed enough that they could use her fingerprints to match her, so had he kept her in that freezer that whole time, because that truck was only 6 months stolen, so where was she before that? Was the freezer in the house? Because if the freezer had been in the house instead of in the truck, he never would have gotten caught, because Jack and Elaine were like, this is kind of weird, and they probably wouldn't have thought anything of a freezer, a deep freezer in a house, because I wouldn't have, and I'm a pretty suspicious person. I'm a firm believer that everything happens for a reason, and I think that this couple, who seemed to be suspicious like me, ran into this man in order for Denise to be found. I don't know. The cadaver dogs hit on that pit. Maybe he had other victims and he moved them, or maybe she was there and he moved her. But I found no evidence of that, but I definitely believe that this guy was a repeat offender, and maybe just the other bodies and victims were not found. But I couldn't find any connections about whether any of the 12 other driver's licenses were missing people or not. They just had a lot of memorabilia from his crimes in his house, which all these weird killers keep all their memorabilia, and it's just absolutely creepy to me. It's almost just as bad as going back and visiting the dead bodies. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I'm curious to know what you think about this case. Do you think it was a case of wrong place, wrong time, or do you think that this man was trolling